Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill and the budget it follows does little to respond to the scale of the challenges facing our country, much of which has been brought into sharp focus by the coronavirus pandemic and the way it's hit our society. Not to mention the long-term hit on our gross domestic product because of Brexit at 4% to the economy, and also 2% hit because of the pandemic, as forecasted by the government's own Office of Budget Responsibility. And nor does this bill, as has already been pointed out, respond to the climate emergency, despite the fact that the UK has just hosted the COP26 summit in Glasgow. The government has no plan for growth, which would put more money in people's pockets and increase tax revenues. And low growth, what we see is a low growth and high taxes approach, which means that there will be a greater burden on working people because of this budget.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. It's making a very important point. And this should not contrast the lack of stimulus really coming from government when you contrast it to what's happening in the US and how the government seems to be making the same mistakes they did post the financial crash of 2008-9.
My honourable friend's absolutely right. The US has already returned to pre-pandemic levels of growth, as have a number of other European countries, whereas the UK is still playing catch-up and needs to learn the lessons of what it's done after the global financial crisis so that we can get growth back up to the level that we need. And, of course, the issue here for the UK is that we've got this additional challenge, which is to make up for the hit on our economy, the long-term hit on our economy because of the trade that we're losing because of our exit from the European Union. And given we have exited from the European Union, we need to know how the government's going to make up for that loss of 4% hit on our GDP in the long term, alongside the 2% that I mentioned. Madam Deputy Speaker, taxes will reach their highest level under this government since the Clement Attlee government in the post-war era. Now, Clement Attlee had a lot to show for that increase in the form of the National Health Service, in our education system, in the welfare state, much of which we continue to benefit from and have benefited for generations. And yet this government has poor living standards, a poor economic outlook and weak economic growth to show for its tax rises. And while the pockets of working people are being hit, this bill, shockingly, allows for a tax cut for banks' profits as it cuts the bank surcharge from 2023, which will, as I mentioned earlier, cost taxpayers £1 billion a year. Nowhere is it clearer where this government's priorities lie and where they think the tax burden should lie. A tax rise for workers and tax cuts for banks. And this government has wasted billions of pounds of taxpayers' money by brazenly giving out PPE contracts to those number of people who are linked to the Conservative Party. And as the National Audit Office pointed out, a significant amount of money has been wasted, and also a high priority channel was provided for government contracts linked to people in government, and they were 10 times more likely to be successful. And some estimates suggest nearly £2 billion worth of contracts went to people with links to the Conservative Party. And as the Public Accounts Committee has pointed out, the test and trace scheme that was introduced that cost billions of pounds hasn't shown the benefit against the amount of money spent. Now, if the government had spent that money wisely, so many billions wouldn't have been wasted on crony contracts, and some of that money could have been spent dealing with the loss of income that many have faced and dealing with the poverty and inequality that people are facing in our country. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill does nothing to improve our country's bleak economic outlook. And what we see is, as the OBR has confirmed, that the UK is suffering the lowest recovery of any major advanced economy. GDP at the end of this year in the UK is further below the 2019 levels than in any other G7 country. And any future economic growth in the medium term is likely to be anemic, with the OBR forecasting an average growth rate of just 1.5% a year between 2024 and 2026. Meanwhile, our long-term growth rate fares little better, as I said, because of Brexit forecasted to reduce UK GDP by a staggering 4% and the 2% hit, as the OBR pointed out, because of the pandemic. If the Conservative government wanted to grow our economy at the same rate as other advanced economies since 2010, the economy would have, if it had done that, the economy would have been £100 billion larger by 2019, leaving over £30 billion more to spend on public services without the need to raise taxes. And on living standards, with poor growth and high taxes, it is no wonder that the outlook on living standards are so dire. The director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies has described the outlook for living standards as actually, to quote, awful, with the country facing 5 more years of stagnant living standards at best. And this is in the context of a decade of stagnant wages. How are people meant to cope with all that's happened over the last decade and the impact of the pandemic and the increase in fuel prices and the cost of food because of disruptions in supply chains? In-work poverty has reached record levels under the Conservative government. There are now 2 million more people from working households living in poverty compared to 2010. And while 6 million families were hit by the £20 a week cut in universal credit, Madam Deputy Speaker, less than a third of them will benefit from the changes to the universal credit taper rate. Now, while that's welcome, there are 4 million others who are not going to get the help they need. And as the Minister herself admitted, many of those people have caring responsibilities, they have severe disabilities, they're not in a position to return to work. Their incomes will go down dramatically. They'll lose £1,000 a year, and that is going to force more people into severe poverty. In my constituency, the child poverty rate has increased over the years and is at 60%. And nearly 20,000 households, which include another 11,000 children, have been further hit by the universal credit cut. And according to the Independent Food Aid Network, there has been an increase in demand at food banks across the country by 66% since the universal credit cut already, and it's been only a few weeks. As we approach Christmas, Madam Speaker, the food bank queues are growing longer and longer in constituencies like mine, and food banks are desperately struggling to cope with the spike in demand, and that's only set to get worse. It seems the government's learnt nothing from the lessons taught by campaigners, including people like Marcus Rashford. In fact, what they've done is made matters worse for people who desperately need support in our country. Madam Deputy Speaker, on net zero, the government has also failed to deliver on its promises, with lots of rhetoric and little substance. Instead, we got a cut to domestic air passenger duty announced in the run-up to COP26. And what we have is a government treating the climate emergency as an afterthought, not as central to what we do in the future. When we need a green jobs and green investment revolution, and as has been said already, where we need a focus on a just transition, the government doesn't seem to have the commitment and the ambition to deal with the climate emergency. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill lands tax rises on working people while giving tax cuts to banks. And it feels like Groundhog Day, because a decade ago, the government's instincts, when it first came into power, was very similar. Tax breaks for bankers and austerity for the rest of the country, and that has continued, and they reverted back to their worst instincts. There is evidently no plan for economic growth, and we're facing a terrible future with low growth and high taxes. And what we need is a government to stimulate growth. We need the government to invest in improving people's living standards and ensure that there's greater fairness in the distribution of income and opportunity across our country. And if the government was serious about growth, about improving our productivity, which has been poor for a very long time on this government's watch, then they would invest significant amounts of money into school catch-up so that our economy can benefit from the investment in skills, in creating an economic future that addresses the challenges we face now. We have a long way to go to catch up with other countries because of the hit on our economy, both as a result, the twin hit because of the pandemic, as well as the long-term impact of leaving the European Union. That's why we needed this government to be creative, to be innovative in terms of policy announcements, and bold in terms of investment in our businesses, small, medium and large, on a greater scale than what we've seen if we are to recover from what's happened over recent years in our country.